friends, and welcome to another video. I'm so glad to have you. Hilariously, for a video where most of it we're gonna be talking about lighting design, the light bulb above me just died, so if the lighting looks a little wonky, I'm sorry about that. I'll email management eventually and maybe that'll get fixed. Today we're getting back to this channel's roots a little bit, as much of my early content on here was about accessible education and accessibility in theater before I went in the more academic direction where things have sat for a couple years. I mean, like, that's academic too, in a way. It just doesn't come up as often for me to have like ideas to make content about accessibility and education now, because I no longer exist in a school setting. So my everlasting fervor for educational reform does not come through as much as it used to, which is tragic, honestly. We all want to see that. But anyway, story time for context. 3 years ago, I moved here to New York City where I live, and I made a video about the concept of accessible staging using what I'd learned from my textbooks and my notes from a couple shows that I'd seen on Broadway right about the time that I got here, and they were all in this little pink notebook, which is on the thumbnail of the video, which I will put up now. The video is going to now be gone by the time this one goes up, but that video did exist. I did that video, I sort of announced my accessibility review series that I do on Instagram, Facebook, and my website, where I provide information to you about specific sensory and content warnings, as well as access information for a venue, like where the bathrooms are, if they're in the binary, if there's an elevator, etc., for every show that I saw. Now, since making that original video where this notebook was only half full, I have made nearly 150 access reviews. I filled up at least this entire giant pile of notebooks. For folks who cannot see the screen right now, this is probably 14 or 15 at this point, and I think I lost some in the move. I remember colors existing that are not in this pile. And also, since then, some theater companies have started paying me to make accessibility reviews for them, so I figured this would be a really great time to remake that video with perhaps a little bit more practical information and concrete examples than what we originally started with, because I had great intentions the first time and a lot of good ideas, but there's a lot more that I want to talk about. If you want to know more about accessibility in arts education and what universal design in that realm can look like, I will attach my thesis video series above and in the description below for you. The link to all of my accessibility reviews will also be linked below. It's mostly for New York City shows, so if you're outside of New York City, it might not be super helpful, but it also includes some New York City places and some places and shows in London, and I leave things up on there after a show closes, so if you see like a transfer to a different country, or that's a replica production or a national tour, that can still give you that information. That's all available for you there. I also, for full like selfish transparency, know it might not be wise of me to be putting this information on the internet for free, because I know I could make lots of money selling this as a workshop, but it is something that I care a lot about. I want to make more publicly accessible, potentially against my better judgment. So if you do want to support me, I have a tip jar below and a Patreon. I also still very much dream of doing this as a workshop with designers and directors, and I think both things can coexist, and I already know that there is interest in the industry. I just need to like get around to it. Anyway, without further ado, accessibility. We're talking about accessibility. I cannot forget the accessibility today. For friends who may need it, I'm a white young person. I have light brown curly hair that is in a blob at the moment. It's warm outside. I am wearing a like coffee colored tank top t-shirt situation. You can't see the design on it, but it says trans rights or human rights. And I'm sitting on a dark gray couch that's in front of a plain white-ish tannish wall, and above my head are some fairy lights and some green leaves. Also, if you need or could generally benefit from captions, I do make all of those by hand for you, and it takes me literally forever, so please feel free to turn those on. They're in the bottom right corner for you. I would love you to make use of them. All right, I guess I should start. Sorry, we've had so many false starts in this video. I promise we're getting somewhere. By introducing myself. Hi, I'm Sydney. My pronouns are they, them. I currently work as a disability historian and access dramaturg in the world of theater, film, and TV, but definitely find my home in the theater industry. I'm also a performer. That's not typically relevant to what I cover on here, so I don't really talk about it. You'll hear more about that one, and if it is ever relevant to content on here. In college, I did a lot of work around accessibility in education and in the arts, and specifically tried to figure out where universal design and Broadway level work can overlap so that all people can enjoy theatrical experiences equally. When I was growing up and seeing touring productions at my local theater several times a year, I was very blessed to be able to do that. I paid a lot of attention to the strobe and gunshot warnings they would put in the lobby of the theater, because I had very severe migraines and like anything would trigger them. But then I would find that those warnings were so incredibly vague that I never felt like it totally helped me prepare for what kind of show I was going to see. It just made me anxious about the level to which it was probably going to trigger a migraine, and also like where in this 3-hour show is the gunshot? You need to be more you can't just say there are gunshots and then let me sit somewhere for 3 hours waiting for it. As an adult, I was lucky enough to get a couple diagnoses that explained the cause of most of those migraines and made them almost completely go away once I got into the habit of accommodating them. I went from like 25 migraine days a month to maybe 5 or 6 a year over the span of a couple years, which is just crazy. But when you spend so long paying attention to a certain kind of accommodation need, whether you need that need or not going forward, you will forever notice it. That pathway of attention never really shuts off. Also same for people around you. My mom will still see shows and then text me and being like, this bit of the lighting design little Sydney would have really struggled with and I thought was bad. And I'm like, well, thank you for letting me know. I really appreciate it. But that puts me in a position where I'm lucky enough that I do not really have to worry too much about my safety when it comes to picking shows to see, but I can report back to you very honestly about what a very strobe sensitive person might experience or how they might respond to a show. And I've also now seen enough of them to understand why certain inaccessible design choices might be used, and while alternate options do similar things visually or vibe-wise just as well, but be more accessible to audiences. We've seen a general decline over the past 10 to 15 years or so in the specific frequency of strobe lighting that we think of when we think of a strobe, right? Because that specific frequency is known to cause seizures in people with photosensitive epilepsy, and is the reason why legally we have strobe warnings at all to begin with. Those originated from that. However, I find the attention to accessibility in design does not tend to stretch out anywhere beyond that, and even then people are often like, well, photosensitive epilepsy is really rare, so why do we need to alter our design for it? And that is true. It's only about 1 in every 4,000 people, though 1 in 4,000 people should be able to safely attend the theater, so that's not even an argument. But also, there are many other groups of people who also are impacted by accessibility in design. About 2% of the population is autistic, which has baked-in sensory sensitivities. It's estimated that anywhere from 5 to 20% of the population has some sort of sensory issue in general. Those data are a bit difficult to nail down because sensory processing disorder is not an actual diagnosis that we can track, but those numbers seem consistently reported, so that's just information, I guess. About 15% of the population experiences migraines in general, about a third of those being chronic, and about 4 to 6% of the population has PTSD, which can also impact sensory sensitivity, especially to loud noises, and also a third of the population has an astigmatism, which can make a lot of kinds of lighting really straining and motion sick causing to the eyes. Not to mention that children in general have a tendency to experience sensory input to a larger degree than adults, and are less likely to know that they have epilepsy going into a show because we don't really use strobes in any other sense of the world anymore. We've kind of gotten rid of all of them, with the exception of that time The Incredibles 2 had some interesting design choices. The occasional film can trigger it, but it's pretty rare. It kind of only appears in theater now, in concerts and stuff like that. But if they go into a show not knowing this, and that show uses strobes, that kid is in for a very traumatic experience, which you would think is rare. People have told me so many horror stories from different times of this happening at Disney shows on Broadway and nationally and around the world, that it genuinely baffles me that they keep designing new works that way, or otherwise think maybe we should rehire the original lighting designer and change 3 things, because it's only ever 3 or 4 moments in a show pretty consistently that could just be shifted and that issue would go away. But I digress. What I'm trying to say with all of these numbers is that a huge portion of the population has some sort of sensory sensitivity, whether they're aware of it and aware that it's something they need to accommodate for or pay attention to, or not. Many people are not. People who come out of your show saying, that was really loud, or oh, it was just a little too flashy for me, are experiencing a sensory issue, even if they're not categorizing it that way. When I start seeing non-disabled people post on the r/Broadway subreddit about something being too flashy or too loud, you know that something has gone terribly wrong, because if they're upset by it, that is an issue. So as long as we can find ways to make shows exciting and riveting using different tools, it is better for an audience's experience and thus a show overall to be conscious of this kind of stuff. At the same time, I'm not gonna sit here and say every show needs to abolish all of the things we're about to talk about, because I very much feel like just about everything has a time and a place. I can be a sensory-seeking person. I can enjoy some cool lighting design stuff. I can happily forgive shows for certain choices they make if I can see why they make sense or why the effect is cool, and if that balances out equally with the inaccessibility factor, I'm willing to let it slide. Even as somebody who isn't necessarily triggered by lights very much anymore. If something is sensorily fatiguing in a haphazard way, I'm not inclined to go see that show again. But if it's something that is in more isolated moments, and those moments make complete dramaturgical sense within the piece, I will go back and just prepare for the moment, and I'm not really bothered by it. Accessibility is incredibly important, but I'm also a practical person. There is probably no such thing as a fully accessible show, because accessibility is so variable from person to person, and I don't think that's an attainable goal. Not to mention that some people are just sensory seeking, and for them, accessibility is actually flashing lights in their face. That can also be a thing that exists, right? I just want this kind of stuff to be factored into the conversation more as a thought when we're designing a piece, whereas right now I feel like it's not even known as a potential piece of the conversation. Hopefully that made sense. So I'm gonna bring up a lot of things that I dislike sometimes, but if you use all of these things, I'm not gonna come at you with a knife. I'm cool with it. I just think that we should be thoughtful before we're making these choices, right? Before we jump into examples, if you are somebody who is sensory sensitive, or maybe aren't sure if you are but want to test out various accommodations, I was still strobe sensitive my first year here when I went to see shows about every week. So here are some of my pro tip recommendations. The first thing is where you're going to sit, which depends on the show. Often flashy shows will have things deliberately hung to point at the orchestra. Most shows tend to be lit for the orchestra. If you think about where they're having the critics sit, right? Before a show opens. That's kind of what they're designing the show to have that be the best seat. So it's probably going to be the flashiest from that seat. Clarification, if a show intends to be flashy and that's the aesthetic that it wants, it will be designed specifically for like where they sit the critics to review the show, which is usually going to be orchestra, like middle to front center. But if you actually want the flashiest experience of any show, which I wouldn't recommend, the closer to the stage you sit and the closer to the sides you sit, because of how lights are angled, that will actually be the flashiest. But I'm specifically talking about like, if a show intends to be flashy for its audience, that's probably going to be a place you want to avoid sitting because it's going to be directly pointed in your eyes deliberately. So if you sit in the mezzanine, you're more overlooking the piece, you're less likely to be flashed in the eyeballs, and any movement that could be disorienting is sort of minimized by your distance from the stage because you're less immersed in it. I found this to be consistently helpful with touring shows. On Broadway, it's really hit or miss which place is going to be flashier, whether it's the mezzanine or the orchestra. Because like Sunset Boulevard, I was really happy to be in the mezzanine because apparently the entire show was in the orchestra's eyes the entire time, but we didn't really get that from up top. Whereas with certain other shows that like to flash lights directly at the audience or like to use disco balls, sitting in the orchestra underneath the mezzanine overhang blocks off like half of the location where they're trying to flash things at you. So it feels less bright than it would if you could see the top third of the stage. And rarely are you missing anything if you cannot see the top third of the stage, with the sole exception of Lost Boys, because a lot of it's flying. If you don't know, that show's a lot of flying. So a lot of the entrances are from up top, and that's kind of important to see. But generally in any other time, it's just like, oh, the set looks cool. It's not, oh, I'm missing things happening in the show. In general, if we think about theater like film, which it's not, but if we think of it like film, like you're going to a movie theater, right? If you sit a lot closer to the screen at a movie theater, things are going to be a lot closer to you. You're going to be more immersed in it, but it's also going to be a lot more obvious when things are flashy or when they're bright or when they're just really close up to your face. Whereas if you're sitting all the way in the back, you can sort of look at it from a distance and you'll probably be less impacted by the sensory experience visually of what the film looks like. So I often find that if somebody has that sort of sensory need and they go see live theater, choosing the same sort of seat option in the back or in the mezzanine to sort of overlook it and have more distance from the proscenium works the same way. Death Becomes Her was a great example of orchestra over mezzanine for photosensitive access because during the pre-show there are blue LED lights pointing straight at the mezzanine audience the entire time, and they are incredibly bright and incredibly harsh, which makes you sensitive and fatigued before the show even starts. Whereas if you're seeing it underneath the overhang, you don't really get a lot of that, partially because they're using the traditional soft white lights of those lighting sconces or whatever they're called that are like underneath the overhang rather than the harsh blue that they have hung up top by the mezzanine. Back to the Future was the same way. I was very glad to be sitting underneath the mezzanine because then we didn't get as much of the disco balls or of all of the flashing that went all the way up the walls in the side of the theater. Rocky Horror is definitely one that I would recommend seeing underneath because the lighting design does go directly up the mezzanine walls. It might actually go up the orchestra walls as well. I don't know. I haven't seen it from down there, but I think it's more lit up in the mezzanine. In general, any show that has a disco ball, you're gonna wanna sit underneath an overhang because those tend to be hung up near the ceiling, but again, it really does depend on the show. If you look on A View From My Seat, which is a website, you can often figure out which of the two is better just from like the vibe of the pre-show or intermission lighting that you see on there. If you live in the city, you can also just go ask the box office. They might be able to help you, or send me an email or DM. I try to see close to everything as I can, or if I haven't seen something, I may have some intel or know who to ask for you. So just reach out and I will answer that for you. My burned out light bulb just turned on and I don't know what's happening anymore. So now that's the thing that exists. If it's a theater without a mezzanine, like a teeny tiny little theater, I would always recommend sitting closer to the back center than not, as the closer you are and the more to the side you are, the more likely something is to accidentally point into your eyes. I also want to note on an access front, of course, that being able to sit in the mezzanine is not a possibility for many people. Many of our Broadway theaters do not have elevators, but generally I do recommend that as a better bet when it comes to lighting the vast majority of the time. Other things to help you prep in advance outside of my own accessibility reviews is Googling the director and the lighting designer to see what else they've done. At this point of reviewing this many things, I can usually guess a lighting designer correctly by the end of the opening number of a show because each person's style is very specific. So looking up who they are and what they've worked on previously can be a really great indicator of generally what you can expect, as can any show footage or advertisements that have been released. Any performance on like Good Morning America or whatever is not going to be a fantastic indicator of the sensory accessibility of a show, but it can tell you the vibe of the show. show, which at the very least can be helpful. Like if you see a performance and you realize, oh, that's a rock musical, you can kind of expect what kind of lighting you're going to get in comparison to something that seems like a chamber musical that only 4 actors are in, right? As personal prep beforehand, earplugs are really great. I'm a Loop fan personally. I don't go anywhere without them. Even just one in can make a huge difference, or having both sit just halfway in your ears. Smuggle in snacks, especially salty ones, if that's something that helps you if you get dizzy. Statistically, it does, so it is worth a try. Also, back when lights were a concern for me and I knew that I was going to see a very flashy show in the evening, I would make sure to spend that day kind of lying low and trying not to do things that wouldn't exhaust me all that much, so my brain would be better able to regulate in the evening, including being very on top of food and hydration throughout the day. And then shortly before leaving for a show, so it would kick in right before curtain, I would take preemptive ibuprofen and occasionally anti-nausea medication, because a lot of times the issue is not that it like hurts because it's flashy, it's that it makes you feel woozy, and you're basically getting car sick. So often anti-nausea can prevent that feeling from happening in the first place. I'm sure that I had other pro tips way back when. Those are the only ones that I remember, so my apologies, but if you have your own, feel free to drop them below. And now we can talk about accessibility from a designer side. The first thing is sound. If you as a designer sitting in the house can understand everything clearly with one earplug in, but it doesn't feel too loud, that is the perfect volume for a show. If it gets any louder than that, it usually garbles up the diction and it's harder to understand what people are saying. And anybody who needs to use earplugs because of the volume of everything else is not going to get any of your dialogue or your lyrics. The one earplug test is also great because one of our biggest issues with sound mixing lately, at least in my experience, has been diction. By no fault of the actors the vast majority of the time. So if you're mixing their speech to be intelligible to a slightly muffled ear, that's going to make this a lot less of an issue. This is another thing that our data haven't quite caught up to yet, but a lot more of the population has auditory processing issues than we previously thought, something we're noticing primarily by the increase in people finding subtitles to be helpful. So the crispness of a sound mix should definitely be a priority. A lot of times a mushy sound mix simply comes from a sound designer having the script in front of them and having heard the show a lot of times so they can understand it with perfect clarity, whereas the average audience member might struggle a little bit. Highly recommend bringing in either a disabled person working on the show who will know the lines but is still very conscious of stuff like this, or an outside friend or something who doesn't know anything about the show to sit in the final tech or even an invited dress or anything else to just give you feedback so that you can adjust it to make sure everybody can understand it. If your pre-show music is at a volume where you have to speak any louder than a typical conversation volume to your seat partner and are still struggling to understand them, it is too loud. Obviously we do want to curate a vibe, and the amount of music I steal from pre-show playlists because they're always fantastic is a lot. But the people in the audience also want to catch up and chat with one another, and if the music is too loud, they're getting exhausted just trying to understand their neighbor and are automatically going to be fatigued going into your show. If you ever see anybody putting in earplugs during your pre-show music who didn't already come into the theater with earplugs in or headphones on, that is a sign you need to knock it down by like 30%. This is a problem that almost exclusively happens in off-Broadway houses that just the volume that they set it at does not match the size of the space. It has happened on Broadway probably once or twice in my experience, but it's usually in the little houses, so it's something to pay attention to if you're in a smaller house. I recently saw a show who I know did change it slightly during the run because I sent them an email and they let me know they changed it, but their pre-show music was so loud initially that it was physically painful for me to listen to with earplugs in, and everybody in the audience was just sitting there awkwardly in silence because they couldn't even try to have conversations with one another, which made for a really weird pre-show vibe. So in addition to being very inaccessible and painful, it also was just like, wow, this vibe curation is odd. So it didn't really work. Also, to marry this with lighting design, if your pre-show set utilizes high contrast lights like reds or blues or purples, especially if they are within the audience themselves, you're going to want to either lighten up the level of contrast on the lights and or make your music even quieter, because we now have 2 different kinds of sensory input that are happening very strongly at the same time while people are trying to get sorted and settled into a new space, and that can just be too much sometimes. There's a difference between setting a vibe for an audience when they come into a space to slowly like prepare them for the worlds of the show and completely disorienting them. And I find that often lately we've been prioritizing the latter, and like discomfort in theater is important when it's used deliberately. I'm all for being uncomfortable in a theater, but I've yet to see a reason why discomfort during a pre-show is helpful, necessary, or a place where it really makes any sense. Pre-show inside of a theater, unless it is an immersive show, but even then, is still a space of transition. You will have all the chance in the world to smack them in the face with the world of the show when the curtain comes up. You don't need to do it prior beyond general vibe curation. If audiences immediately feel overstimulated and confused when they walk into the building because it's such a stark shift and there is no room for transitional moments, they will automatically be more on edge for a show, which we don't want. Unless you do, but even a spooky on edge kind of pre-show vibe can be done in an accessible way without punching your audience in the face. Sweeney Todd is a fantastic example of this, was May she rest in peace. The stage was pretty dark and sparse with some light smoke and haze going on that never spilled into the front audience, if I remember correctly, which made the theater feel like a cavern that was going to swallow you whole, but it wasn't overpowering or overwhelming or scary in any regard. It was just a little bit spooky, and it worked really well. And honestly, in a season that was really heavy on pre-show playlists, it was eerie to walk into a theater that was just like silent and dark and cavernous. That in and of itself was creepy. So like that worked while being very accessible. I will also use Sweeney as an example again for my next thing, which is that there was only one moment in Sweeney Todd, it was a very accessibly lit production, where they used flashing lights. But the moment of flashing lights, which dramaturgically made sense, it's during City on Fire when the inmates escape the insane asylum and everything's becoming rather topsy-turvy. It utilized bright white LEDs that flickered, which just from a stylistic perspective somehow felt anachronistic. You don't kind of expect that color of white to exist in the 1800s, but it was also just unbearably bright. Had it been a more warm white or even something closer to a lightning strike, it would have felt completely different. Same vibe, same effect, but without taking the audience out of the piece. In general, with things that absolutely require a white flash to look real, like a lightning strike or a camera flash, I usually recommend that it's isolated to a certain section of the stage. So like maybe all of the cameras are happening in the back left corner. That's what Lacage at New York City Center just did. It was just all the way in the back left corner. There was also a production I worked on that had lightning that had a flash over here, and then it had a flash down in the bottom, and then it had a flash in the center. So it was in different places, so it didn't feel as like consistently flashy in somebody's face. Also with camera flashes, you can usually choose to angle the flash backwards away from the audience so they can see what we're taking a photo of rather than having a camera flashed in their face, which is ideal. And generally with timing, we want to keep these things pretty isolated. So rather than 12 camera flashes on top of each other, just have one and then break for a second or two and then have another one a little bit later. A single flash is generally a lot easier to handle than like a barrage of them. You're gonna see this theme pop up a lot when we talk about lighting here, where generally the existence of an effect isn't an issue. It's the frequency, angle, and visual contrast of it that tends to be what turns something from a lighting choice into a triggering lighting choice. Ow. Another example of a strobe that could be just slightly different to be way less of a problem is in Aladdin during the song High Adventure, when the three friends go after Aladdin, and it's like a 20 to 25 second white light strobing just on like down light on them above the three of these people as they run in place. Which, first of all, if it were amber or yellow, would be a lot less of an access issue. For those of you who don't know things about accessibility and lights and how eyeballs work, things that are harsh in the white and blue category tend to be the most straining on the eyes, especially for people with photosensitivity issues. So even just the swap out of a crisp white to a warm white or an amber is going to make a world of difference for just about everything. I also personally tend to prefer the aesthetic look of an amber. That might just be me. It feels more like artsy and theatery than like a hospital clinical style white. For a personal example, my entire apartment is lit with yellow lamps and yellow fairy lights. They're technically listed as warm white, I believe, or like tungsten. They're on the yellow level because the big lights in this apartment are all like white LEDs, and I literally only turn them on to film videos because my eyes get so tired and I hate them. But I digress. The aesthetic of Aladdin is very yellow anyway, so an amber would have felt a lot less out of place here. But also, if the intent is to show they are traveling, why have the same fatiguing effects going on for 20 to 25 seconds when you can replace it with some like slow moving downlights on the floor across the guys to give it some motion, perhaps in a way that makes it feel like, I don't know, they're going through a desert and then an oasis and then a city and then another desert using, I don't know, some color and a light filter or a gobo. That would be way more visually intriguing for that entire really long cue in comparison to this same stationary and visually fatiguing thing that goes on for a very long time, especially because that is typically the moment in this show that triggers seizures for newly discovered epileptic kids, which makes it extra unnecessary in my book. But even outside of that, we can do better. Also for non-lighting people who are sitting through this, and I appreciate that of you, a gobo is like a stencil you put into a light so a certain shape or design comes out. Today it's kind of a trade-off as to whether something is a gobo or a projection. It can be kind of hard to tell at times, though I think design still leads more gobo than not because we're used to it, but it used to be that anytime you saw any kind of lit shape on a stage beyond like a square or rectangle, because it was usually done using shades and stuff like that, it was using a gobo. You can also make custom ones. I have a custom one on my wall behind me up there that you cannot see that we use for Curious Incident because we couldn't find a dog one we liked, so we just cut a dog out of a pie tin. But anyway, back to lights. I just didn't want you to feel left out if you didn't know what that word meant. It's a really good word, so you should have it in your vocabulary even if you wouldn't use it. What am I saying? Another strobe that feels a bit unnecessary to me is the one in Hadestown where Orpheus is getting beat up because they're doing really cool fight choreography there, and I just feel like the lighting obscures it, which may have been the intent, but what that show does best is physicalizing things, and so that specific scene being obscured just feels like a missed opportunity a little bit. Generally, Hadestown is a really great example of accessible lighting because they do, especially in Act 1, they do a lot of cool stuff on the walls and the sides of it that is gives an illusion of motion but isn't motion heavy, and it's really cool. If you're going to use a strobe light for anything, and sometimes it is needed, I've never seen it make sense for longer than 5 seconds unless the scene is happening inside of a nightclub. Like, some of what & Juliet is going on is unbelievably inaccessible, but because of what the show is, it makes a lot of sense. Same with 6, though House of Holbein has like full stage green strobe the entire song, which feels a bit too much to me. Even in a nightclub sense, there are ways to balance this out by doing like 5 seconds of one kind of lighting and then switching to another and then to another and back. That limits eye fatigue a little bit and gives the audience a chance to breathe because it's switching between stuff rather than being the same thing for forever. So like doing, I don't know, 5 seconds of an on-off strobe and then switching to lights moving around on the ceiling and then switching to using a different color. The act of changing it up turns the fatigue level down a little bit. If you need examples of what this could look like, take literally any light that has several settings and hit the setting where it switches organically between them. Some of those can still obviously be way too flashy, but if you slow them all down and evenly transition between them, it can be a lot easier for an audience to take in without killing the stroby nightclub vibe you would want to create. And that also brings us into the speed factor. A lot of lighting movement or the speed with which something is clicking on or off is just too fast, and that's the only issue with it. The light itself is perfectly fine. It just needs to be slowed down by like 50%. And I often find that slowing down a cue a little bit actually helps it to be processed by the audience a bit more, and it automatically feels more like deliberate and cinematic. Again, I'm so curious by how much of my taste in what I like to see in theater is just related to it being accessible versus just, oh, this is just what my taste is. We may never know. I love a good moment of motion, like a slow water effect on the floor or even a spin can be really great. It just needs to not be a dizzying speed. And I often find dizzying light to be distracting from the performance itself because it is harder to focus on what's going on because your eyes are just like, whoa, there's a lot going on. And that's not really helpful for like centering the people, which I feel like should be our goal. I don't normally film at night, and this is why. What am I saying? There's also the where is the light being pointed situation, which is one of my biggest pet peeves because it's super fixable, with an exception, which we'll get to in just a moment. But generally, contrary to apparently popular opinion of late, your audience does not like being blinded. That's not a thing. Not a single time have I gone, wow, I'm so glad they just put a bright white slowly washing over the audience directly pointed at my eyeballs. And it's the only lighting cue I've ever seen where an audience almost universally recoils in real time. I get that sometimes we want to unsettle or slightly jar our audience. I don't know if that's the way to go about doing it. I've also very rarely actually seen that lighting effect used for the purpose of unsettling an audience. It's usually meant to create hype, which I find it doesn't really do because it makes everybody be like, ugh. We've also gotten into this habit lately of putting like LED screens of lights on either side of the proscenium that point directly at the audience and flashing those. So it's like a full rectangle of flashing light rather than like normal light size and shape. And as somebody who again lurks on r/Broadway a lot, those screens are 100% responsible for every single I'm not photosensitive, but I wanted to give a heads up because this lighting was really hard for me post I've ever seen come up on that page or on any other social media platform. It is always exclusively those lights pointed at the audience. A huge offender of that right now is Schmigadoon, where the rest of the show is very accessibly lit, but the entire thunderstorm right at the beginning is just those lights flashing white on and off at full brightness for about 15 seconds. I do think that's happening to mask a set change, but there simply has to be a better way to go about that. It is unbelievably disorienting, and again, so many non-disabled people have complained about it, so that, again, flags that it's a larger issue, right? The Greatest Showman stage adaptation also did this, and apparently the current Beauty and the Beast tour, which is by the same lighting designer, also has this element somewhere in it as well. I came across that somewhere, where there's lights pointing directly at the audience, and in Showman, it was flashing at full brightness between full blackouts. The design idea behind it was super cool and super thrilling, and I was super behind it. I liked it in theory, but if it had been done with downlights on the stage, it would have been just as effective without being literally physically painful because it was just lights literally on the edge of the stage pointed directly into our eyeballs. Again, acknowledging this is a show for children, and there are at least 5 or 6 of them in the audience that day that I went wearing ear defenders, and thus attention to access and lighting should be doubly paid because we have a high disabled audience of children, which makes it a larger problem. Things can be excitingly lit for an audience without flashing them in their faces. I, again, can defend the occasional strobe. This one, I've never seen a time where it works or makes sense, or I've been like, yeah, I liked that choice. Every time I'm like, well, it could have been done a little differently and it would have had the same vibe without being painful. Except for, of course, my single caveat, which is there's a very specific lighting choice that I will put a photo up on the screen right now that only fits in this category as a technicality as a light that points at an audience. Just to give photo credit, this is from Beau the Musical, which was off-Broadway in 2 different venues last season. But I've also seen this utilized in Mexodus as a more recent example. And this is any concert style or indie style show that has these lights on the back wall that are usually round. They're between an amber and a warm white usually, and the level of brightness they can get to is never like, ow, I'm squinting kind of bright, because they don't really create beams in the way that lights we typically point at an audience do. And usually when they're used, it's for vibes, and they're at maybe half power at maximum. There's also so many of them that the contrast of it remains low, because it's not just like one light beam in your face, it's just a bunch of light. Contrast is also going to come up a lot in this, where it's way worse to have flashing lights happening while the stage is otherwise dark, or a lot of lighting choices we make today are inaccessible solely by nature of them being of high contrast with everything else that's going on. And if they were in a lower contrast, so like at 50% rather than 100%, or the stage was a little bit better lit, so then the strobe is only feels like it's at 50%, that also negates so many issues. But there isn't really a replacement for this specific kind of like warehousey, grungy vibe that these kinds of lights give off. There's one or two moments in Hadestown where they get maybe a smidge too bright, but otherwise these tend to be pretty unoffensive as long as you watch their levels when you're programming it, and they aren't flashing ever, which is great. When they're steadily on for vibe purposes, I am very cool with it. And frankly, when they move down a back wall while pointing at the audience in like a jagged little pill kind of moment, perfect. Also in the realm of, hey, where'd you point your lights and did you think that was the best move? Flashlights can be a huge offender of this as well. I too love a flashlight effect. We use them in my intentionally accessible Curious Incident production because they do something very unique that no other lighting can do. But the number one thing that we never want to do with flashlights is, say it with me class, point it directly into the eyes of our audience. That's right! This is another thing that often by definition needs to be high contrast and dim, thus I suggest it's only used wisely, deliberately, and for a very short period of time. But if you cut down the pointing it at the audience or really quickly waving the light around on stage, 80 to 90% of the issues that exist with flashlights have now been fixed for you. It's quite simple. Another thing is shiny stuff on stage can cause accidental strobes at times. Hadestown is a huge issue with this because Orpheus's guitar is very well polished, and sometimes it catches the light in a way that is really painful. The tables do and the cups do as well. It's a very accidentally flashy show if you're sitting in the right spot. Sweeney Todd also had this issue significantly with his blade because it was so crisp and shiny. This is often unavoidable and like has its reasons. I'm just pointing it out in case that's something you want to try to avoid or something you might want to use to your advantage. Like having a table that is shiny enough to reflect light in a house of people who are struggling with money has a very different meaning than having it be sort of matte, right? Like that's also dramaturgically important. Also on the topic of showing money, it's not uncommon for designers to show poverty by having a light that constantly buzzes. That's awful. That is physically painful. Please make it go away, I beg of you. And also flickers throughout a scene. Any sort of design choice where an audience member spends half of their time wondering if they are hallucinating it or if it's a real thing probably shouldn't be happening in the first place. And if you're like, what are you talking about, City? That doesn't really make any sense. For a lot of people with like chronic migraines, they will experience their sight going in and out sometimes. And so if they see, or they'll see something flickering that isn't flickering, these are common auras, or like an aura is kind of like a hallucination you can experience right before a migraine that can warn you that one's about to come on, or can also simultaneously be a trigger. So a common aura that I used to experience was the smell of weed. My brain would just hallucinate the smell of weed. So anytime I would smell weed, I'd be like, oh no, am I about to get a migraine? And then I would have somebody else be like, no, there's somebody smoking outside. And I'd be like, great, and I close my window and I'd be fine. But if you're having a design choice that accidentally mimics a migraine aura, you're gonna have certain members of your audience be really stressed as to whether that's the thing that their brain's coming up with and they're about to have a medical emergency, or if it's just a thing that's happening in your show. So I generally try to avoid it where possible. And also in general, constant flickering gets very exhausting very quickly and is distracting from the scene, so it generally should be avoided. You can have your lights flicker twice when they go on and have a very brief buzz that says the exact same thing, and it mitigates all of these issues. Those shiny plastic curtains that blow around and shimmer are also something that can cause a sort of dizzying visual effect, especially if they're like the full stage, and especially if they are the silver ones. I found the pink ones to be less of an issue generally. But for example, Merrily We Roll Along had a silver one across the whole stage for like a 5-minute long scene. It was so long. And I heard some folks commenting on struggling with it that weren't me, though I also did. And that was the only inaccessibly lit moment of the entire show, if I remember correctly. It was just being frustrated at this curtain. Generally, the issue with them is that they both move and they refract light, and then they tend to be behind the action that we're trying to put our primary focus on, which for some people can be just too much movement to keep track of, and it gets exhausting, if not makes a person, again, car sick. These curtains are another thing that have a very specific time and place. They do craft a very specific vibe, just something to keep in mind should you choose to use them. Same thing goes for disco balls. It's the exact same problem, just on a larger scale, because the way that they reflect light, it's a ball of mirrors. It's very, very shiny and very disorienting and creates a feeling of movement in the space, which can be disorienting for people. So again, if you're going to use it, we want to do it for a short period of time. We want to do it very, very deliberately. And ideally, if you can make it not white or blue. I know most disco balls they sell are silver, but I have seen golden ones, and I find that those are a little bit less awful. But again, something that you can totally use. You just need to do it deliberately. On a reflecting light angle, I haven't seen this happen in a few years. I am grateful, but sometimes shows like to use mirrors on stage, and I'm not talking about like a cute little hand mirror situation, that's fine. I mean, it can cause accidental strobe, but don't worry about it. I'm specifically referring to an entire wall and or floor being reflective. Funny Girl and Harmony were both huge offenders of this. I've never quite seen the logic of this design choice dramaturgically. It also amplifies every lighting accessibility issue you could have like 2 to 3-fold because it refracts everything sometimes multiple times, which just gets exhausting for everybody after a while, and it makes it hard to visually focus on what you're trying to pay attention to. Also, on the topic of more historical shows, those bulb lights that you use to give like a cabaret effect, I'm thinking like we saw in Gypsy, we currently have in Rocky Horror, these curate the same amount of vibe at half power as they do at full power, and at full power they start to teeter into motion sickness territory for some people because it can feel like the entire stage is moving, especially if they are up the side walls as well. I always love a good bulb light moment. They definitely have their place and they're lovely, but they are usually way too bright. You can knock that down a little bit and the vibe will be the same, I promise. This also goes for the choice to have like neon bars around your proscenium or in various places around the set as well. We saw this recently with Chess and with Old Friends off the top of my head. Generally, I find they create this weird brightness contrast, especially because they're usually paired with some kind of shiny set. That's always something I warn people for because it does frame the eyeball focusing in a way that can get tiring after a while. Another issue I'm seeing pop up more and more is projections designed in a way that almost wants its audience to get motion sick. Redwood was a massive example of this. I was no longer technically strobe sensitive by the time this show happened, but that show made me very ill. I don't know if you've ever been on the ride Soarin' at Disney. There's also one in the Mall of America, turns out, but basically how it works is you sit in these seats where your feet dangle and it basically just like turns you like side to side and like front to back while it plays these projections below you and then puts certain smells and sounds and stuff in the air so it feels like you're hang gliding over all these places around the world. It's magical. It's very cool. It doesn't make you all that motion sick unless you're very prone to motion sickness because you're moving along with the projections and it's a really fun time. But now as we've seen projections get more high quality, we sometimes have shows where it feels like Soarin' is happening on the stage in front of you, but you're sitting still and it gets really disorienting really, really quickly. Redwood did this effectively from start to finish in what was a 2-hour runtime with no intermission, and also the pre-show was wall-to-wall bright LED white screens, which already set you up pretty poorly for what the show was going to be on a visual fatigue sense. This effect has also been used to lesser levels in the Radio City Christmas Spectacular to make it seem like the bus is driving around the city. It also popped up during the driving scene in Tommy off the top of my head. I can't think of when I've seen it recently, but it is in something else. More often than not, it's utilized as a shortcut to make it look like a vehicle and or group of people are traveling. And I do think it's cool in theory, but in execution, I think I would rather just suspend my disbelief or use some sort of older theatrical trick to simulate travel because it does quickly get really exhausting and just like disorienting. It's just kind of like weird to see movement that doesn't feel quite natural to your eye and you're like, what's going on? And it's really bizarre. In general, moving projections can become issues really quickly because while they may move less than say your average film on the movie screen, they're also competing with the movement of the set and the people on the stage who you're trying to focus on. So then the projections movement often becomes peripheral movement that's clashing with the movement happening in your central vision. And so if it's too fast or it's too disorienting in some other way, like it's some kind of illusion, it gets very easy to get car sick from that. And some vague numbers have been thrown out by various researchers that about 1 in 3 people are pretty susceptible to car sickness. So again, not great odds for our audience here. Also, on the other side of the contrast coin, we have dimness. Another thing that does really work in some settings, and I totally understand why people use it. Obviously, Doubt Comes In at the end of Hadestown is a fantastic example of this working perfectly. Lost Boys also makes a fantastic use of shadow work. In general, Lost Boys does a really good job of like avoiding many of the highly straining choices we tend to associate with rock musicals and scary musicals in favor of just being like really, really eerie and like quiet in a way that it works beautifully in their favor. I like it a lot. A well-earned lighting design Tony Award in my book. But in general with dimness, sometimes shows will choose to light the stage solely with one lamp for vibes or something like that. But the longer that we have to squint to understand what's happening on the stage, the quicker we are to stop trying to squint and lose interest and zone out, which gets exhausting unbelievably fast. And again, we're not engaged with the piece any longer. You can and should always choose to supplement practical lighting with a little something extra to make sure that everybody can see. Part of this is also actually an auditory processing access issue, because for many people, they rely on lip reading a lot more than they realize. So if we can't see the people we're trying to lip read, we literally cannot follow what's being said anymore, and then you've lost your audience member, and that's not ideal. I've also seen some more indie style off-Broadway shows of late make some contrast choices that are things I didn't even know I'd have to have an accessibility conversation about, because they never crossed my mind as being a thing that a show would do. I'll leave these shows unnamed. The first thing is, if you've ever been to one of those museums or whatever that has like lights that make everything look black and white because the contrast is so high and it makes your brain feel a little bit funky, it was like that, but between different colors and for the entire runtime of the show. And I got so nauseous and motion sick, I had to take off my mask just to figure out how to breathe so I did not puke on the audience member in front of me. It was unbelievably disorienting. And it was an immersive show, so lighting design in general for immersive pieces is inherently about 10 times more difficult on accessibility front, because you have to light the audience to light the actors, meaning the lighting is going to be stronger, potentially more of an issue. But this was really, really aggressive and like directly on us, and it switched between that and being very dim or being in complete darkness. I did include this in here, but also sometimes shows, to be like, we're an in-community vibe, will choose not to darken the audience as much, and so all of the audience members can see all of the other audience members. That also can be an access thing. A lot of people feel really uncomfortable with that, and part of what they enjoy about going to a show is being able to sort of sit back and experience the show and not be perceived themselves. So that is just a thing to sort of factor in and think about when we're talking about comfort of audience and audience engagement. Another show made a choice to have about 30 to maybe 45 minutes of its runtime be in complete pitch black darkness with the occasional white flashing light. Both times, for both of these choices, I also cannot figure out for the life of me why dramaturgically those choices were made in the first place, but also obviously complete darkness is a huge accessibility issue because it is disorienting. It's also a huge safety issue because it is disorienting. If you're gonna have anything be completely pitch black in a show, I'm thinking Oedipus or Sunset Boulevard as recent examples of this, please try to keep their blackout under 30 seconds, absolutely maximum. I have never seen a time where it made sense for it to be that long, and especially not any longer. I'm literally begging you, please do not do this. On the topic of smoke and haze while you're here, because those shows also had that, I personally have never had an issue with it beyond when it spills into the front orchestra and one cannot breathe, and when it doesn't dissipate very quickly, so you're like squinting for 10 minutes to try to follow what's happening because it's all really, really hazy. In my opinion, if your smoke is unscented, it's used deliberately and it never makes it into the audience, and you're very like on top of it when it's on versus when it dissipates, and make sure that it does so quickly. Have at it. I know it's always factored into these warnings we put outside of our theaters. I've never actually met anybody who's like, oh, it is haze and smoke, I can't do that. It can like dissipate lights weirdly sometimes, right? But I've never seen it become a huge access issue in my experience, at least. Don't take my word for it necessarily. There may be a lot of people who do have issues with it, but I feel like the issues usually relate to like asthma. And again, if you're not having it in the audience and it doesn't get into the audience, that fixes that. But I might be missing something on that front. Also on the smoke side, if you're going to have people actively like smoking on stage, please try to prioritize unscented options. Cigarette usage can be an absolute turnoff for audience members for a very good reason. And if they are used when lit, please use only when absolutely necessary. I promise you that you can curate a 1970s vibe with the very occasional cigarette. You do not need people smoking from the beginning of your show to the end of your show to prove it's the 70s. This and gunshots are the two most common things I see people stressfully ask about before booking tickets to see something. It literally is affecting the amount of people who are coming through your door to see your show. So it is a thing to pay attention to. Gunshots in general, in my opinion, should only ever be used if absolutely necessary, and whatever options sound real but is the quietest. Some people are very sensory seeking and they like strobes and they like disorienting and all of the other things I brought up thus far. Never have I met somebody who's gone, ooh, a gunshot, I can't wait. They are overwhelming. They are exhausting every time they happen. Do not use them unless absolutely necessary. That is not vibe curation. That's stressing people out. Also, every usher in your theater should know how many there are and generally where in the show they are should somebody ask. If you need examples as to how to say where gunshots are while being spoiler free, check out my access reviews for functionally every show that has a gunshot. I really try hard to be as specific yet vague as possible. So for an example, I recently saw a show where I asked an usher beforehand. I sometimes check in on accessibility at theaters to see how people are doing, and maybe that's wrong of me, but I'm curious. But I saw a sign that said there's gunshots in this show, and so I asked an usher like, oh, how many gunshots are there? Do you know where they are? And she was like, oh, I think there's only just one, but it's at the end. And so I was like, okay, thanks. And then I spent the entire second act wondering when we're about to near the end, to being stressed about it because I didn't know when the end of the play was. This shot did happen right after a very certain character got out of the pool, which would have been a spoiler-free specification that would have made my viewing experience a lot easier, for example. Generally, any kind of jump scare sound you might feel inclined to use probably isn't necessary, and if it is, definitely can have the same effect without making people feel like they have suddenly been stabbed if you turn down the volume by like 50%. This sort of teeters onto the content advisory struggle. We're gonna move out of me railing on lighting design because I'm sorry, I love you lighting designers, you're doing great. But people say that we shouldn't have content warnings because they're spoilers, nobody wants spoilers. But content advisory can encompass a lot of very different things. I also prefer using the word advisory because it's not like, warning, this is what it's about, but more of like, hey, heads up, you might want to know this is what this is about before you go into the room. Very different vibe. So I like to use advisory for that reason. The first piece of this is actually marketing. If your play is about something heavy, your advertising team trying to pretend it isn't is an accessibility issue. The absolute most frequent offender of this is the star vehicle shows where the only advertisement is, come see this person who's famous on Broadway. And that's how you end up at Redwood, not realizing the entire show is about addiction and child loss, or in the front row of whatever the play was that Jean Smart did. I'm blanking on the name. With no real way of leaving because one was put in the front row, not realizing the entire show is about domestic violence. For a positive example, Fear of 13 did a great job because the photos they used are clearly in a prison. So you know this play is about prison and you can decide whether that's a thing that you're up to seeing or not. It is true that vague marketing may get more people through the door, but it will also get more people who, for personal safety reasons, shouldn't be seeing a show about that topic and are now at risk of a medical emergency inside of your theater, outside of your theater, just in general, which is, to be clear, bad. And who will, by definition, come out with pretty terrible word of mouth because they probably shouldn't have been there in the first place, so they're gonna have a pretty darn bad time. And that's not their fault. That is the fault of the advertising. I recently saw a show centering somebody I really admire that was kind of autobiographical, and nowhere did it say before I bought my ticket or walked in the door that it was going to be really sexually explicit for the majority of the show. And because I really admire that person, I felt really uncomfortable hearing and seeing very in-depth portrayals of this person's sex life, which I think is a fair thing to feel weird about. No judgment to this person, that's just not content I tend to consume in general, and especially would not have voluntarily about this person specifically if I had known, and I can't lie, I haven't really been following their career since because of that experience. So their lack of proper advertising and of giving proper advisories has now actually lost them some following. And that's a problem, right? That's unfortunate. When we think about content advisories, we often think about like a list of every bad thing that comes up in the script that's taped to the door of a theater that isn't super helpful. But content advisories are your marketing. They're the thing that comes up on the ticketing page. Like every show that has nudity will inform you before you buy your ticket that it has nudity, for example, so you can decide if that's for you or not. And it's also not just for making the do I go or do I not go decision. I am a huge fan of really heavy, really dark plays. That's where I'm at. I'm in the middle of House of the Dragon right now and I'm having a fantastic time. But I'm not gonna go see two of them on back-to-back nights. That's not a good safety choice, right? I'm also not gonna spend my entire workday reading about eugenics on the day I'm gonna go see something I know is really heavy, so I don't overload my brain and I'm capable of processing everything healthily and properly. I might choose to, I don't know, pack a fidget toy or something for a show that is like that in case I need it to help me process it when I typically wouldn't have one because they do take up room in your bag. Or expanding that further, somebody might have emergency snacks because eating is a really great way to help reset during a panic attack, because if your digestive system is working, then your body's like, well, we must not be being stabbed right now because we're digesting. Or a meltdown kit that's kind of maybe a big one, so they only bring it places when it might be needed. And so they would use that content advisory as a heads up to be prepared. With Redwood, right, like we talked about earlier, the projections, or with that very high contrast immersive show, I don't carry emergency medication on me anymore because I don't really take it anymore. I sometimes travel to other states and forget my emergency medicine kit at this point, which notably has been dumb of me, and it is now on my perpetual packing list because it also has band-aids in it and I walk into walls. But in both of these situations, I was sitting in a theater where I had no heads up about what kind of show I was about to see due to marketing failure on both their parts. And so I didn't bring the emergency anti-nausea medicine I really wish that I had had both times around. I turned out fine. Nobody puked, died, or passed out, which is great. I also don't really do any of those things. I tend to, anyway. But that would have gone a lot differently and I would have been able to experience the rest of the show rather than just being like, please don't die, had the show given any heads up beforehand. Obviously, that's not quite the same thing because it's a lighting access thing versus a content thing, but it's a similar idea, right? Also, from a playwriting and dramaturgical side, you don't need to use all the traumatic content you wrote. I promise you. We have this idea that something being heavy and dark and including every possible content warning means it is a masterpiece. And categorically, the more heavy things your audience has to process concurrently, the less they are processing it. It's one thing if they're all intertwined, right? Like you can't talk about sexism without talking about racism, without talking about ableism, though most of those things will usually not talk about ableism at all. Wholly another thing if you're trying to hit trauma event bingo because you think it's going to pack a punch for your audience. You're just weighing down your material and your audience, and their processing gets jammed up like a computer trying to upload too many files, which impedes their ability to fully interact with it and connect with a piece in real time because there's so much to process. Again, I love me a dark and heavy piece with a lot to, parse out and unpack, but only if each piece of the dark and heavy feels intrinsic and deliberate to the narrative at hand. It otherwise just feels exhausting and overwrought. And that will be increased tenfold in your audience members who have complex trauma, which is more likely than not going to be your most minority audience members, who are the demographic we are trying our best to get more of those people into the theater, and so we should really be paying attention to those kinds of things. And also, in my opinion, it just makes for a better piece of theater, but that may just be me. Also specifically for my male playwrights, in the content of trauma inclusion, you don't need the assault in there. You don't need it. You don't need it. That is like the number one thing that I feel like is just thrown into things specifically to create an arc for a female character or an arc for a male character to feel something about a female character. You don't need it. You can do so many other things. You don't, I promise you, please leave it out. I beg of you. Some other really important accessibility things to factor into your design include your runtime. We're seeing this increasing popularity of a one act with no intermission, which I am a huge fan of, but we're also seeing that extend to mean it's just 2 hours with no intermission, which is simply too long. Apparently, according to research, the average person needs to pee every 3 hours, though every time I've ever been on an organized road trip or anything, we do bathroom stops every 2 hours. But we then also need to factor in, we're selling them alcohol, which makes people need to pee more frequently. People may have had wine or coffee with dinner, which is the same thing. Also, people don't pee the second the show starts. They do when they get into the theater, and then they sit down for 20 plus minutes before the show begins. And then with the bathroom line after, it may be another 15 or more when the show is done. So with a 2 hour runtime, we begin to see an issue here just for the average person, right? Like, we're about to hit that 3 hour mark. And then we factor in people who are pregnant, people with disabilities that make them pee really frequently. Not afraid to say I'm one of those people. Again, the alcohol and caffeine piece I just mentioned, and it's just too long. I've also never seen a show be over 100 minutes that couldn't have shaved itself down to be a better show that was 100, maybe 105. And I specifically bring this up because a lot of the 120-minute shows, or longer, I saw one that said it ran 120 and it ran, I think, 145. We got out at 2.5 hours, but it started like 10-ish minutes late. Still, way too long. Those tend to be shows that have a no re-entry policy under any circumstances. In addition, Oedipus was an example of this, I believe because they blacked out the exit signs for the final blackout, and so due to like fire marshal reasons, nobody could be moving around during the show. Don't quote me on that, that's off the top of my memory. But this is also happening a lot with more indie shows that are happening in the round, or in an immersive way where you literally cannot exit without stepping onto the stage and thus interrupting the show. It is really stressful and you feel unbelievably trapped. The show that I mentioned earlier where I had to take off my mask was one of these, where I was like, well, if I end up having to puke, it's going to have to be on the person in front of me because there's literally no way for me to leave this theater until the show is over. And that is just unacceptable. We cannot be putting people in that situation, and it's such a fantastic way to make sure a patron will never come see another show at your theater again after that experience, because that is genuinely kind of traumatic. I have seen shows in that theater since then, but I've been really anxious. It has made it a lot harder for me to go back into that specific building, which is unfortunate, right? Also, to bounce off of that experience, having clear exits, especially in immersive or small theater shows, is incredibly important. In hindsight, I think if I had snuck out of my row, the stairs behind me might have gone up to like where the lighting booth was, which inevitably has its own exit that wouldn't have required me to stand on the stage, but I didn't know that because the only entrance and exit I knew of and was told about was on the other side of the stage and required me to walk across it to get out, which also, again, safety hazard. Exits should be more clearly marked and pointed out in case of, say, fire, but also for people who might have a small medical thing they need to step out to take care of, that should be better marked. Otherwise, you're going to have potential disruption of your show. In general, with anything immersive, or not immersive actually, having clear signage is really helpful so people know where to go and they can figure things out without having to come up with the courage to ask for help. This is one thing I really adored about London and really missed when I got back here, which is that everything was clearly labeled in giant print in a way that we just don't have in the United States, and it was an absolute lifesaver. And it also made for a lot less clogging of people because everybody knew where they were going and didn't need to stop to ask for questions. Another accessibility thing just to keep in mind is to try to avoid utilizing text on the stage that doesn't have any auditory counterpart. Huge pet peeve in films, less of a pet peeve in theater, but still notable because not everybody can read whatever size font you chose to use, or may be dyslexic or otherwise have some sort of literacy disability and may then miss out on serious and important context. You can make it sound cool and narratory. I know it's possible. Please don't pull a Star Wars, I beg of you. At least don't on film, you can like pause and scroll back. You can't do that live. You just kind of miss stuff. Now at this point you might be thinking, well, Sydney, a lot of what you brought up here is fixed by things like live captions and audio descriptions, and also people can just go to relaxed performances. Why should we care about this for the general public? Which is where I bring up what we call the curb cut effect. Curb cuts, which are like the indents on the ends of sidewalks and stuff like that, those are created so wheelchair users could cross the street. What they also do is make it easier for people with baby strollers, people whose knees kind of struggle with steps, little kids who can't quite step that high yet but insist on walking, and many other groups of people who don't realize they need or at least benefit from these things, we would consider to be accessibility tools because they've never tried them before, because they've never been available. And the same thing happens with anything else, right? Like part of the increase in caption use is because now everything on streaming platforms and even most pirating sites, which is impressive, now easily has an on-off toggle for captions. And so people have realized they make it easier and less fatiguing to understand what's going on, and so now they utilize them all the time, even if they wouldn't meet the diagnostic criteria as somebody who might need that access tool, nor would they voluntarily go to like see an open captioned movie in theaters, right? But they do find it helpful and useful. So we need to acknowledge the existence of that accommodation gap. It's also not uncommon for patrons to show up to theaters and then learn that the captioning and or audio description systems are down, or the devices don't work, or something else is broken. Not to mention that it's hard to both hold a captioning device and watch everything that is going on the stage. But even in the case of open caption performances where it's a lot closer to the stage, or ASL interpreted performances, which are the same, not the same thing, but are both closer to the stage, most theater companies only have one captioned and or interpreted show per run. So if you're busy, you miss the show entirely. And they more often than not schedule them at the same time as other major theater companies, having their only captioned and or interpreted show. And so then you have to pick which show do you actually want to see, because you can't get access to all of them. I went to a comedy show where the audio description system broke, and the initial plan was to just say, sorry, come back another night, to the entire back like right corner of the theater that was entirely blind people. It was delightful. It wasn't clear whether it was ever going to be fixed. So the comedian just Googled what audio description was and then did it live on stage as part of their performance. And it was hilarious, and it gained so much respect for me for that comedian because of how it was handled. It was beautiful. But like, those systems don't work a lot of the time. Also, when it comes to relaxed performances, which in the United States have been mostly rebranded as sensory-friendly performances when they're usually inherently not sensory-friendly because everybody's allowed to make noises they need to throughout, which is great. But I would rather take 10 strobes to my face than sit in a loud audience for what my personal sensory needs are, so it's not sensory friendly for me specifically. Shows having one of those a year is a miracle, if even. And even then, it's usually almost exclusively the shows that are more oriented towards children and or tourists. That deep, hard-hitting political play that you really want to see, and for some reason chooses to use strobes and loud sound design, isn't going to ever, under any circumstance, have a relaxed performance. That's not even on their radar. And for most relaxed performances that do exist, again, remembering like the curb cut effect, right, and all the different conditions and life experiences I've listed that impact people's experiences of sensory input, at least 85 to 90% of these people aren't even thinking about the fact that they might need a relaxed performance for a show to be accessible to them because they don't know they have access issues. Especially in the United States, where we tend to see sensory-friendly performances as being specifically for autistic people, when the concept was actually created by and for people with Tourette syndrome who experience tics that may be disruptive to other audience members. And nobody really knows that, which is interesting, right? So there's a very selective group of people who feel like this is actually meant for them because of how it's marketed, when actually it's for a large group of people who are never going to ever even think about going to it, right? So while these are incredibly important tools to have, and I'm glad that we do have them, they are not a solution to any of these issues by any means. They're just like a separate third thing that can help sometimes. Accessibility also obviously includes, can disabled people get into your theater, and do they have somewhere to pee? It also includes ticket prices. Most of our accessibly priced ticket options in the United States do not have options for wheelchair users or deaf, hard of hearing, and blind or low vision people who may need to sit in specific seats in the theater to have better accessibility in order to see and or lip read what's going on. And those are the disabilities that the box office knows about accommodating. If you go up and you say, hi, I'm photosensitive and due to strobes, I need to sit in this specific section, only maybe 2 occasions has a box office ever understood what that meant and moved me on a lottery win. Those occasions were 6 at the Lena Horne and Back to Future the Winter Garden to specifically shout those folks out. Whereas another show that I will leave unnamed yelled at me for asking, and I haven't asked since. I haven't needed to ask since, but I also used to sometimes test it to just see what the policies were so I could tell you guys about them, and I've stopped testing that because I don't want to experience that again. But earlier in my time in the city, on multiple occasions had to buy much more expensive seats, not because I wanted a better sightline, but because I knew it would be safer due to how the lighting of a specific show was going to be, which is a structural issue. Accessibility also includes general information and clear advertising, like we talked about earlier with content advisories. If your show centers around a very specific and triggering theme, that info needs to be made apparent from the jump so people can self-select as to whether that's a safe choice for them. It's one thing if something comes up once, I don't think I could name a show for you that doesn't have a singular mention of somebody taking one's own life or of parent death. But if the entire central theme is a triggering concept like domestic violence or self-harm or grief or child loss, having people walk into your theater not knowing that is a safety issue. For immersive or otherwise non-traditional shows, I'm thinking like Cabaret, for example, it's totally fine if you want to keep things under wraps, but have a separate thing that somebody can click on that has a specific guide as what they can expect. I didn't see Cabaret until several months after it opened because I was waiting for somebody to go and then give a very specific rundown on the internet of what the experience was like so that I knew what to expect going in, because I knew it wasn't going to be a traditional theatrical experience, and that stressed me out. I still haven't seen Masquerade because most people's descriptions have not been clear. Also, the tickets are expensive, and I already made the video about Phantom, so there's not really an academic reason for me to go. And how do you access review that? I also haven't seen Ever Brilliant Thing for the same reason. So again, by hiding all this information, you are losing customers. And as theater makers, especially right now, we want to be getting every butt in a seat we possibly can. In addition to the ethics of just wanting to be inclusive, I just know that sometimes money can be a little bit more persuasive. Most shows in London do have a visual story of some sort that breaks down what to expect buried in the accessibility portion of their website. Nothing's being spoiled for anybody. You can just find the information if you need it, and it would be useful to you. It is there, but if you don't need it, you won't have that spoiled for you. By accessibility reviews sort of function the same way. They're ordered from least spoiler-heavy information to most spoiler-heavy information, so you can pick and choose what's useful to you. Clear communication and information is so incredibly important. Also, if something is immersive and or requires audience participation, you do need to provide ways to tap out. Comedy shows specifically have been working really hard in this access issue because they realized people weren't coming due to fear of crowd work. So I've been seeing places use red, yellow, green stickers or bracelets to indicate who wants to be interacted with, who's okay with it but doesn't want to be a first choice, and who wants to just be left alone to observe, which makes a huge difference in the feeling of comfort and safety for your audience, and they will be more likely to come back time and time again. Now, one thing that often comes up as a question whenever I talk about integrating accessibility into anything, especially in the education world, but it comes up in theater as well, is like, okay, but how do we make sure that we're not prioritizing comfort over art? And I think it's important to try to make a crucial separation in our brains between comfort and safety. By letting somebody with PTSD know beforehand that the show they're going to see is about one of the things that triggers their PTSD, we are now preventing somebody having a medical emergency in our theater. That is good. By making sure that our sound design is at a reasonable volume, we are making sure our audience can actually enjoy a piece, and by having a show with 50% less flashing lights than we ordinarily would have chosen to have, we're making sure they don't go home with a headache, and that becomes the only thing they remember about your show. There's a time and a place for making an audience uncomfortable and doing that deliberately and with intent. Again, there are times and places for strobes or moving lights, even a jump scare. I thought the jump scares in Lost Boys were absolutely perfect and also easily explainable without spoilers to somebody who doesn't like jump scares. I really appreciated that. A lot of these things can work really well with deliberate purpose, and if they're done well a handful of times in a show. It's when they're constant and they're not thought through that it goes from a deliberate artistic choice to unsettle our audience to an accidental choice that is a genuine safety issue. There will never be a fully accessible show in a design sense or in anything else. There is no such thing as full accessibility because access needs clash all the time. How to Dance in Ohio actually tried to advertise themselves as being a fully accessible show, and I kindly emailed them and I was like, you cannot claim that because that will never be true. And it's better marketing to say you thought about it and worked toward that rather than claiming you fixed a fundamentally unfixable issue. That's beside the point. They did change the language in later publications after that email, which I did appreciate. But coddling an audience and putting comfort first would be spoon-feeding every piece of the show to them, taking out literally any content that could be triggering, refusing to challenge our audience, and having the lights just be like on the whole time. I don't know. Nothing exciting, nothing moving, nothing going on. Whereas accommodating an audience is making information available to people who may need it, to have more information to be able to engage with being challenged, and factoring in what a huge portion of the population definitely needs into how a show is put together from the ground up, because it can make your audience safe so they can enjoy the pieces of the show that are hard and nuanced and dark and scary and all those other things. Also, if we are building a world on our theater stages from the ground up as being accessible for our audience, we're doing it for our actors too, right? Our actors are the ones who are having strobe lights in their faces 8 times a week. That is exhausting, right? If we're thinking more about that, we're making life easier for our actors. We're also making it so more disabled actors can be on stage and can be in shows, and that is equally as important. That is not on my focus here because my focus is sort of what you see from the audience, but this also very much impacts the other side of the industry. We can't sit around and be like, oh, we should be casting more disabled people. We want to see more disabled people on stage, and then make no effort to make it so that there was a world where a disabled person could safely step into. Our audience cannot fully deep dive into or enjoy the content of the work if they're just trying to get through the show in one piece. It's the same thing with education, right? We know that students in traumatizing environments redirect their focus to survival and become unable to learn, which is something that is exacerbated in minority communities. And so a lot of the central stuff that we do in education for accessibility is just basic communication, basic trauma-informed practices, because we know that's how people will then be able to learn. This is the same exact situation just for an event rather than a classroom. But also, not to get like pretentious at the end of a very long video, I like to think the point of the theater is for us all to learn and be educated about our fellow humans, so it's not actually all that different. Anyway, that's all that I have for you today. I should go to bed. I really hope that you learned something or gained something from this. The kind of accessibility issues with very easy fixes are the kind that irk me the most, so feel free to join my crusade. Send this to any designers and or directors you may know, or just start emailing people when you think their design was just super inaccessible. And yeah, as always, thank you for being here, thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy, as is being really thoughtful with any choice you make as somebody creating something for the consumption and or experience of others, because about a quarter of the United States population is disabled, so we should probably start acting like it at some point. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.